Call to order the May 22nd, 2018 Santa Barbara City Council Finance Committee meeting. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to speak to anything that is not on our regularly scheduled agenda, but is still within our purview? Seeing no one, we will go for the first item of the agenda, which is the recommended, no, it's not the recommended budget, it's the third quarter investment report. Ms. Nemes.
Good afternoon, Chair Hart, committee members. I am Julie Nemes, the Treasury Manager. I'm here today with Jennifer Tomaszewski. She's the Accounting Manager, and we are presenting the third quarter financial review for fiscal year 2018. There's a few different areas we'll be covering today. I'll be focusing on general fund revenues. Ms. Tomaszewski will be focusing on general fund expenditures and also the enterprise fund revenues and expenses. We have included the proposed budget adjustments in your handout and in your packets, but we won't be covering them today, but we can answer any questions you have on them. So moving on to general fund revenues. This first slide is a summary of all of the general fund revenues, broken down into three categories: taxes, other revenues, and fees and service charges. All of the charts I'll be presenting today have the same general layout. We have the annual budget, the year-to-date budget through March 31st, and that has been seasonally adjusted for taxes and franchise fees, but not for the other categories. We have year-to-date actuals through March 31st, and then the variance between actuals and budget, and we also compare it to the prior year. So what I wanted to point out here is that taxes and fees and service charges both are coming in under budget, whereas other revenues are performing better than we anticipated, higher than budget. One of the important things to note here, though, taxes, that variance is a pretty big variance. We have we have a one-time distribution for property taxes in there, and I'll be going into these details on the next slide. And we also have a timing difference that I'll be covering. So this variance is not a true variance. Overall, it's showing our revenues are coming in about $3 million, but as I said, there's some timing differences and one-time impacts here. Getting into the details on tax revenues, and I'll provide a slide with some of those adjustments so you can have a better feel without the one-time adjustments and timing differences. But moving on to the general fund tax revenues, there are a couple different areas I'll be covering. The first is sales and use tax. And this is what was making up that significant difference of $3 million compared to year-to-date budget. This is almost entirely due to the Measure C sales taxes. We did budget $5 million for Measure C, so about 3/4 of that is included in the year-to-date budget. However, we will not receive a distribution from the state till June. So that makes up a large part of that variance, about $3.6 million of it. Once you remove that timing difference, we are still seeing sales and use taxes coming in below budget. We saw some one-time impacts from the Thomas Fire and the debris flow event in December and January. And we also are continuing to see this decline in brick and mortar retail sales in favor of online sales and services. We are estimating by the end of the year to be about $900,000 below budget. For our property taxes, right now, as of March 31st, is about $1 million over budget. I wanted to point out we have a one-time distribution in this number. It is about $717,000 coming from the sale of the property previously owned by the redevelopment agency. That was our allocation, was $717,000. So once you take that out, property taxes are still performing better than budget, but not to the tune of $1 million. Transit occupancy taxes are slightly below budget. We did see some one-time impacts from the Thomas Fire and debris flow event, and we do anticipate we'll continue to see a negative variance by the end of the year. And the last one is business license, coming in about $100,000 below budget. This also, we saw some impacts from the Thomas Fire. We also had some vacancies in the finance department that impacted us contacting businesses for renewals. And so we think we'll make up some of that difference in the fourth quarter. And so we'll be negative by year end, but not by $100,000. So now that we've seen some of that one-time property tax distribution and the Measure C sales taxes, I wanted to show you that first slide with that number taken out. So we had the original year-to-date variance for taxes of $3.1 million. But then we have the Measure C adjustment and then that one-time property tax adjustment for the RDA dissolution. And that ends up showing our total revenues are about online with budget. Taxes and fees and charges are still below budget, but they're being offset by gains in other revenues, and that's largely due to mutual aid revenues that I'll get into. So general fund other revenues, there's a few areas I'll focus on. License and permits, there's not a big year-to-date variance, but I wanted to point out that we've received more than 100% to date, and that's almost entirely due to over $100,000 in revenue from cannabis business application fees. Fines and forfeitures are coming in about $112,000 below budget. This is due to reduced revenues and parking enforcement. We had some staffing vacancies in the beginning of the year that caused the difference, and we also had some impacts from the fire and debris event. Intergovernmental is a positive variance by $1.2 million. This is almost entirely due to mutual aid reimbursements for the fire department. Only $600,000 was budgeted, and almost $2 million has been received to date, and we do expect to receive even more than that by fiscal year end. And lastly is miscellaneous, which I'll be getting into on the next slide. We break this down for you further. But overall, general fund other revenues are coming in with a positive variance, and really it's due to mutual aid. So there's two categories in miscellaneous that have a variance. The first being a miscellaneous category. This is entirely due to timing of payments, and we'll meet budget by year end. The second one is operating transfers in is $486,000 below year-to-date budget. This is due to a couple factors. The first one being traffic safety citation revenues from the county are down due to some staffing shortages. And we also had some positions in the Gulf Fund that were moved to the general fund during the restructuring. And there was a $145,000 contribution that was due from Gulf Fund to the general fund that was not needed because those positions were put into vacancies in the general fund. The last category I'll be covering is general fund fees and service charges, and there's 4 areas in specific. The first being Parks and Recreation is about $107,000 below budget. There is some seasonality to this one. We don't adjust the year-to-date budget for seasonality. However, Parks and Recreation does tend to have more revenues come in towards summer, so that makes up some of this variance. Also, there were some impacts from the Thomas Fire and Debris event on rentals. Public Works, we've seen this throughout the year, continues to come in below budget. This is almost entirely due to staff vacancies and billable positions in the engineering division, but this is largely offset by salary and benefit cost savings that Ms. Tomaszewski will show you later on. Library is about $190,000 over budget, but this is all due to a timing difference, and by year end we expect to meet budget. And lastly is reimbursements, about $183,000 below budget. This is due to some interdepartmental reimbursements that are booked at year end, so we expect to meet budget. So overall, fees and service charges are coming in about a little less than $500,000 below budget. So those are all the variances, and I'm happy to answer any questions before I pass it off to Ms. Tomaszewski.
Thank you for the presentation, Mrs. Nemes. Any questions? Nope. I think we're ready for Ms. Tomaszewski.
Thank you. So as Ms. Nemes stated, I will be going through the general fund expenditures and the enterprise fund revenues and expenditures. So this first slide, this is the general fund expenditures broken out by department. In the first column, we see the annual adjusted budget is about $139.6 million compared to our year-to-date budget, which is based on a 3-year benchmark for to account for seasonal trends. And that's about $103.9 million compared to our actual year-to-date at March 31st of $99.9 million for a variance of $4 million at third quarter. And just to highlight a couple items here, first is fire. We see fire is actually over year-to-date budget by about $2.2 million, and this is almost entirely mutual aid activities. And we do anticipate that the revenues will come in well above the overtime costs we see here. I think for a surplus of over $1 million by year end between the revenues and the increased expenditures. And I did want to quickly point out these non-departmental, this $3.2 million variance. This is, again, the other side of that Measure C. So we have it budgeted to transfer to the Measure C fund once we receive it, but we haven't received it yet. So if you back out the Measure C, what we see is that $4 million is really closer to a little less than $1 million. And the trend in the last couple years has been larger variances at year end for salary savings across the board. We know, for instance, police has filled many of those vacancies. We still see some of those vacancies in public works, parks, library, community development, but that that variance is smaller. So we're filling those positions over time. So now I'm going to discuss the enterprise funds, and I have this broken onto 2 slides. So this first one being solid waste, wastewater, and downtown parking. So solid waste is coming in about 1.2 million below year-to-date budgeted revenue, and this is almost entirely the result of the reduction, the decision to reduce the solid waste rate increase from 5.3% down to 2.1%, and this was related to the tipping fees with the delays in the Tahigas Resource Recovery Project. So we anticipate this will be about 1.5 million by year end, which will be covered through solid waste reserves. On the expenditure side, we see about a 1.3 million variance on savings, and this is really timing. There are some delays. The contract hauler has been delayed in getting the invoices to the city, so we're not anticipating that the savings will be here by year end. That the budget will be spent. On the water fund, we see third quarter revenues are coming in over budget by about 5.9 million. There's 2 factors here. First, about 4.2 million of this relates to water sales. At mid-year, we reported that the water sales were coming in the higher cost tiers, the tier 2 and the tier 3, which are higher cost per unit than the tier 1 residential, and that pattern has continued into the third quarter as well. And the other largest factor being that we received about 900,000 in reimbursements from CCRB and COMB, and those are for water purchases from the prior year. So they do a true up at the end of the year, and I think it's my understanding that they being CCRB and COMB. And I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on the acronyms, so I'm sorry. I apologize for that. They tend to be conservative in providing what those costs are going to be. So therefore, when they do the true up for last year, we received about a little less than $1 million reimbursement between the two. So on the expenditure side, we see about a $8.4 million savings. There's actually several factors that make up this $8.4 million, but the 2 largest being with the delays in the completion of the desalination facility. There were intermittent operations in the plant in the first several months of the year, which caused, I think, account for 3 to 4 million of the savings that we see here. They don't anticipate additional savings since I think even mid-year it's been fully operational. And the other large item is a $2 million payment that was programmed into the budget for the payback of the debt service on the construction of the desalination facility, which has been delayed into fiscal year 19. Wastewater, I just wanted to quickly highlight, we see about a $1.5 million savings on in the expenses at third quarter. Most of this, there are some salary savings here, but most of this is the timing of debt service payments that will happen by June. So the savings, we won't see the large savings here at year end. So the next slide is airport, Gulf Fund, and waterfront. And airport, I just wanted to quickly point out, they're tracking fairly close to the year-to-date budget, but I wanted to point out that we see that the actual expenses compared to last year at this time are 19.4% higher. Really, this isn't the operations. This is the capital outlay transfers for capital projects, which can fluctuate significantly from year to year. So with the Gulf Fund, I wasn't really going to address the revenues. We do see revenues are slightly down due to the Thomas Fire, but we see about a $500,000 savings with on the expense side. And there's 2 factors that contribute to this. The first being Corsco, the company or the contractor that's now running the operations of the golf course. They submit monthly reimbursement requests, and we refund those back to them or reimburse them back after the fact. So there's a 1-month delay here. So 9 months into the year, we've only reimbursed them 8 months worth of costs. And then the other item is when we went into the contract with Corsco, there were a couple positions that were displaced that were moved to the general fund until permanent positions could be found, or the retirements of those positions. And since then, those positions have all been absorbed into other positions, which now, because of that, the Golf Fund no longer needs to reimburse the general fund. So that's about $145,000 of that. And that's also where you see some of the variance from last year. So we've spent less this year, and that being one of the reasons, and the other being that the COP bond is now paid off. So that's all I had for the enterprise funds and the general fund expenditures. I would normally go through the budget adjustments at this point. To save some time, we've decided to forego that. I did want to point out that one of the budget adjustments that you'll see throughout I think we had like 11 pages of budget adjustments. And one of the contributing factors for that is one of the reimbursements related to this administrative services took an item earlier in the year relating to the benchmark study that they did for supervisors and managers positions. And at the time, the budget adjustments for those were not presented in that CAR. So this is to account for the increases as a result of the compaction and realignment in the funds to hold the departments harmless for those changes. So you'll see, because it's salary in across the city, there's a lot of funds that were impacted by that. So that's one of the adjustments you'll see throughout those 11 pages. Of those, it was about 440,000 that will be offset from reserves, about 185 of that being the general fund. So other than that, unless you have any questions on the budget adjustments, we just would like to recap and say that, we are requesting that your committee accept the interim financial statements. And I apologize. I realize that says the second quarter, and I missed that. That should have been third quarter. And the attached budget adjustments. And with that, we'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions for Ms. Tomaszewski? Councilmember Friedman.
I'll move the recommendations.
Okay, no questions. Is there a second for the motion?
I'll second the motion, but I do want to ask about the proposed amendments. Do you happen to have a copy of those?
I do. The budget adjustments?
Yeah.
Yeah. There are.
These are the ones we went over at a previous Finance Committee meeting?
We usually bring budget adjustments with every quarterly report. These are, I think last quarter there was only like a page and a half. There just happened to be more. A lot of them are corrections, items that, grants, and when we have to do grant cleanup and if we close a project, those types of things. We just wanted to point out with the salary for the managers and supervisors, because it impacts reserves.
Great, thank you.
And also they are, I believe, in the end of your handouts. In your handouts, there should be copies of the budget adjustments. Oh. Maybe I didn't. I thought I did. I'm sorry.
We could wait on the motion just so folks have time to take a look at the budget adjustments, if that is helpful.
Yeah, they are attached in the CAR.
Okay, all right. Well, then we do have it as part of our packet then. All right. Is there any more discussion of the motion? Any other questions? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed and abstain? Matter carries unanimously. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. Next item up is our banking services agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. Bob Stormario, Finance Director. So this is a really quick item giving you an update where we're at on the banking RFP. So a few months ago, we sent out a request for proposals for banking services to a dozen or so banks. And we received in December or January, we received 6 responses, both local banks and national banks, larger banks. We had a team that evaluated those proposals. It included not only banks around the area, like I said, but also included our existing bank, Union Bank, is one of the 6 proposers. So we have an evaluation team that went through them all and ranked them and so forth. And you may recall that we came to you back in the fall with sort of a discussion of what the criteria might be in terms of how we select the banks. And we also indicated that we would be back to you to give you sort of a status before we just made a decision. So this is kind of that update. So of the 6 banks that responded, 3 of the banks really couldn't meet our minimum requirements. They're so small that some of the important things that we need in terms of services like lockbox processing, all utility bills, they couldn't meet those requirements and other things like that. So I appreciated that they submitted a proposal, but they really didn't have the resources and the infrastructure to meet our needs. So we're down to 3 banks. One of them, again, is our existing bank, Union Bank. Chase is in the running, and then the other bank is Montecito Bank and Trust. Montecito Bank and Trust is the only local firm or bank that met the minimum requirements. We are right now in the process of getting more information from these banks to clarify information, to clarify proposals, and also clarify fees and all that. But they're all sort of in the running in a sense. But we haven't made a decision. We haven't completely finished the rankings since we're still getting more information. The one thing I wanted to point out was that the 2 banks, Union Bank and Chase, both are involved in the Dakota pipeline. So because of that, we had assigned 15 points toward social responsibility. So both of those banks, it was all or nothing. Either you get 15 or you don't. So that's obviously going to impact the scoring. But because of fees and other things, that they're really all kind of on equal footing at this point until we kind of refine our analysis. So we wanted just to point that out, that we have Union Bank, Chase, who are involved in that project, but they're still in the running because we decided, and you decided, that we wouldn't categorically exclude any bank because of that. The one thing we are going to take into consideration is Union Bank did provide a decent proposal. Their fees are substantially lower than where they are now, which is good, but a little frustrating as well. And so one of the things we have to kind of also factor in is it's going to be a 12-month, 18-month process to put in place a new bank. It's like upgrading a new financial system. It's a major effort, major workload. So we have to kind of take that into consideration. If Union Bank is providing fees that are very much lower than they are now, and of course we know they can meet all the services, is it worth chasing some more dollars or cheaper dollars, for example, but go through all the implementation of a new bank? So that's something we're talking about or thinking about internally. So that was it. Just wanted to kind of give you an update of what we're thinking about, but we'll be back to you with more information once we kind of come up with our more firm recommendation.
Councilmember Friedman?
Thanks for the update. I had a question more in the staff report. You mentioned that one of the prior issues was that Union Bank could not collect or accept monies that the city collected from cannabis. So they changed their policy, so I assume the other 2 banks, you've conversed with them and they can as well?
That's correct. In fact, one of the banks that we felt was submitted a very strong proposal was Bank of the West. And the language was a little vague in their proposal as to whether they would be willing to accept their cannabis money. And so we talked to them, and they said that they can't really officially say they can. They say they might be able to, but so that's an important thing for us to be able to accept cannabis money, of course. So they're really out of the running because of that, and they understood that, but that was unfortunate.
Any other questions for Mr. Samario? What is the timeline then for doing the additional information gathering and?
Yeah, good question, Committee Chair. We will be making a decision, in my guess, in the next 30 days, if not sooner.
And you'll be bringing that back to the
Yeah.
Finance Committee before you make that decision?
Yeah,
or
we'll come
giving
back.
us a recommendation?
Just because we want to keep you informed of what our recommendation is going to be before we come back with an actual contract proposal.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Any other questions? Any comments? Okay. Next item on the agenda.
So, yeah, so this is now we're on to the budget. And as you know, this is the last of the meetings with Finance Committee where we're going to be going over the budget. And this is the time we'll be asking you for final directions and recommendations. You've seen a lot of things. We have some new information to present to you today, but so at the end of this meeting, we're going to look for a final direction and recommendations to council. So there are some new things we're going to cover today. One of them is the staff recommended adjustments, and Mr. Brandon Bodette, our budget manager, will be covering that. And then at the request of Committee Member Friedman, we're going to present the Arts and Economic Vitality budget. This used to be called the Community Promotions budget. It's within the Mayor and Council's office. And then we'll follow that with a presentation on Measure C and General Fund Capital. It's all General Fund now. We're just, in terms of source of money, one is the General Fund revenues versus Measure C. So we'll kind of show you the whole picture of what we're proposing for next year and how it kind of looks going out in years. And then we'll be looking for final recommendations from the committee on all these items, plus items you've seen in the past. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Bodette, who'll cover the staff recommended adjustments.
Chair, members of the committee, good afternoon. So effectively, I have two adjustments for you. There's multiple lines, but there's really only two adjustments. The first one has to do with the strategic energy plan. So what this is it's a $200,000 item that basically we're moving from the general fund over to the facilities capital fund. So we're reducing the appropriation in the general fund. The general fund was to fund half of it, and then enterprise funds would reimburse for the other half. So we would transfer $100,000 from the general fund to the facilities capital fund, and then appropriate the funds in the facilities capital fund. So that's effectively one. The only other adjustment has to do with the Gutierrez Street Bridge project. This was actually already appropriated. It went to council semi-recently, so therefore we don't need to appropriate it in FY19. And that's actually it for adjustments.
Any questions for Mr. Bodette? Okay. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to, along with Mr. Casey, he's going to be here as well for any questions, of course. And so I'm going to present the community promotions budget, or the arts and economic vitality budget. Again, this is within the general fund, and it's within the mayor and council's office. We give money to a number of organizations, so I'm going to kind of go through it in sort of an organized fashion. When we get to the grants to arts organizations, the second item, I'll go into a little more detail because I think there are, I'm not sure that some council members are familiar with how that process works. And Miss Sarah Rubin is here. She works for the county, and she's kind of the executive director that handles the sort of this program, if you will. So starting with that portion, so money we give to the arts, if you will, we provide funding to the county for two staff people. One is Miss Rubin, and the other is Hannah, and I can't remember her last name, but two staff people who run the program and basically help in determining how the monies are going to be allocated. The amount of money that actually gets dispersed for this current fiscal year was $323,000, and there's different buckets, if you will, of that money. Where it goes, there is what's called the events and festivals funding. That's about $106,000 this year, and I'll talk more detail about what these involve. But another category is organizational development funding of $150,000, community arts funding of $48,000, and then there's this other pot of money that's a little less structured, but it's for cultural arts districts and some other items. So the community arts grants, this portion of our bucket of money, it's based on recommendations made by the City Arts Advisory Committee. Again, Sarah and Hannah both sort of administer this process to develop recommendations for City Council. But this category includes support for specific projects by arts organizations and individual artists who have a partnership with an arts or educational nonprofit organization. There's a maximum, I won't go into the details, but there's a maximum grant per entity of $6,000 for this category. Organizational development, this is based on recommendations in terms of funding by the City Arts Advisory Committee, separate from the Events and Festivals Committee, and this allows organizations to use grant funds to build capacity, plan strategically, and remain stable and vibrant, and they must be a nonprofit and located within the City of Santa Barbara. The third is events and festivals. These are recommendations made by the city's Events and Festivals Committee. And these committees, by the way, have been around for many years, 20 or 30 years. But this pot of money is designed for nonprofit organizations that produce and or manage events, festivals, or innovative program series during the shoulder season. So they're not designed, for the prime time for us. It's for the off season, if you will. We give money directly, as you know, summer solstice, 4th of July, Old Spanish Days. Those are prime summer events, and they're kind of what we call line item organizations to which we give funding. This is sort of the off season, if you will, and this is done through this process. And then the last bucket of money is the smallest, is about $18,000. This is for cultural district and miscellaneous projects, so it includes the annual art symposium, the City Poet Laureate Honorarium, the City Hall Arts Gallery exhibitions, which of course you see, and then the art that goes near the Granada Garage, the Jardín de las Granadas. Other funding we provide to is the TV Santa Barbara. That's the Community Media Access Channel, CMAC. We give money from the general fund, operational funding of $313,000. It's fixed. Once upon a time, it was well above that, but during the recession, they were one of the organizations where we cut funding by a third. So it's now down to $313,000. We also provide funding really as a pass-through for capital. They get half of the 1% in PEG fees that are charged to Cox Communication or charged to Cox Communications. It amounts to about $135,000 a year in terms of the portion they get. So this is not a general fund funded amount of money. This is really a pass-through from Cox Communications for PEG, which is public educational and government access. And then we also give money, again, as I mentioned, sort of directly through a line item to other community promotional programs or events. It totals $317,000 this year. These amounts do not include staff time, particularly for like police overtime. So we give direct funding to Old Spanish Days of $104,000, Summer Solstice $68,000. The film festival, even though it's not considered a sort of a summer primetime event, it was determined a number of years ago that it was because of its significance that it would become a line item, if you will, and they get $80,000. And then the 4th of July parade, $5,500. And then Visitor Information Center, this is the Chamber of Commerce. They manage this Visitor Information Center on Garden Street near Cabrillo, and we give them $59,500 per year. So back in 2006, all of the city's contributions for these various areas were consolidated into one program. This is when it was moved from the finance department into the mayor and council's office. And next year, and this is based on conversations with Nina Johnson, who administers all these contracts, that there'll be further consolidation to improve economic vibrancy and support to the business community next year. For next year, the budget will remain unchanged, $2.6, almost $2.7 million, and there's no change in funding for arts organizations. And then one of the last items are organizations we give money to is Visit Santa Barbara. That's going to be maintained at $1,380,000 next year, and we've not seen that change in a while. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions before we go on to Measure C and other general fund capital.
Councilmember Dominguez?
So when you say in 2019 we're further consolidating activities, what does consolidate mean? Sounds a little scary, like something out of 1984.
Yes, and so this Nina Johnson was going to present this. She's out of town. Remember, this was planned for last week, so I'm going off a PowerPoint that she presented, and I'll have to get back to you on what that actually means, unless Mr. Casey knows what the intention of that was.
I think it's just It's emphasizing her increased dedication towards the economic vitality and downtown business issues. She works with all citywide, all the business organizations who might have business assessment questions. Coast Village Road is asking. Milpas was engaged a while ago. Downtown Santa Barbara. She's leading the effort on the freeway underpass, the art design RFP process to get vitality there. She is kind of the city's point person, working with the business community, the women's economic venture visioning process that they had just a couple weeks ago. She was instrumental in coordinating that with them as well. So I think it's just kind of talking about her little broadening scope and focus on economic activities downtown.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure it didn't mean reduce or somehow diminish. And Puppet Palooza, was that involved, or did we get involved in that in terms of promoting that, or was that completely independent? And I'm asking because I thought it was a great program, and it was unfortunate the timing with the Thomas fire.
Thank you so much, council members, staff. Puppet Palooza is a new venture, and it received the maximum award from the Events and Festivals grant pool. So they received $15,000 in support from the city of Santa Barbara for the Events and Festival grants, which again seeks to look at programs that will bring in hotel and restaurant revenue and contribute to those TOT funds. So they did receive that funding from the city.
Great, thank you.
Absolutely. I'm Sarah York-Rubin, Executive Director of the Office of Arts and Culture. We've partnered with the city for over 35 years to serve essentially as the city's arts department. And through the contract, which is as $151,000 go to staff support, and that goes towards an executive director, also a curator, and a grants and contracts manager. It's 1.4 full-time employees cumulative, but we also have actually 7 people working on our staff. So it's a shared partnership between the city, county, and actually state of California, which gives $70,000 in because of this model and additional support to administration for city and county programming that we're able to leverage the partnership for. So that's been a pleasure, and I'm always happy to talk more about the different programs that we administer.
Councilmember Friedman.
Ms. Rubin, can you explain to us, there was that economic vitality or contribution from the arts study that came out a couple years ago. What
Absolutely.
the total
So
amount is?
that was administered in 2016, and it was a partnership again between the city and county with Americans for the Arts, assessing the value of the nonprofit arts sector. And it looked specifically reached out to any nonprofits who could participate. We had 93 participants out of over 250 identified. And it demonstrated that it's those 93 are a $200 million revenue stream for the county in terms of the money they put in, and it's largely focused in the city of Santa Barbara, which is the cultural hub. But $8 million go directly into taxes that go local taxes, 12 to state taxes, and the city also in the country is 9th. In the country in terms of per capita cultural practitioners, so artists that we have living and working here, which also goes back into that tax revenue, but that wasn't assessed in the Arts and Economic Prosperity Study, which we participated in since its inception in 2000.
Is the county increasing its contribution this year?
Both the city and the county contributions have are remaining level. So we're looking at the 18-19 is the same as the 17-18 commitment for the past 2 years. We are lucky to share resources such as we have access to county council, the county car fleet council, meaning the attorneys, and risk management. So it's and office space. So it's been a great collaboration in terms of city and county being able to utilize each other's resources, both financial general fund and also looking at the broader spectrum of services that we're able to provide on a relatively low investment threshold.
Thank you. Has there been CPI adjustments in the past? Is this What is the historical trend of addressing that?
Yeah. I mean, you might.
I can actually speak. In 2016, the 15-16 budget, it was a 3% annual increase. And then for the last 2 years, it's been flat. But it had been looking annually at about 3%.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, we've kind of dealt with it similar to, do we have revenue available for departments to increase their budgets incrementally? And if so, then we would treat them the same. But since we've kind of been in status quo budgets.
Okay, so that's philosophically consistent across departments, with the exception of human services by council direction. Okay. All right, well, thank you, Ms. Rubin.
Absolutely. And I actually I'll pass it out. I brought a printout of the different, so the city funds in some small capacity hundreds of arts organizations through these grant programs that help sustain those programming and access to the arts and arts education. So I actually have a printout from the last CAR that I have just as a handout for you to look at kind of some of the projects through the 3 different grant programs that the city has funded to get an idea. And this is 16-17 because I thought it was a better fleshed out version. And we will agendize that with the budget. And actually, starting at 1 today, one of the panels is meeting to make recommendations to send to Arts Advisory, which will then go to City Council for final approval.
Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Chair. With your permission, we will move on to Measure C.
Thank you.
And also the General Fund Capital, so that you could see the two combined together, because I think you really want to look at them kind of as one package, but we do want to present them budget-wise differently. I will give a broad overview of what our recommendation is for FY19, the first full year of Measure C. You can see in the audience, I have told every department to be here to answer your detailed questions that you have, and they are, with smiley faces, ready to dig deeper into it. So my dive isn't as deep as, if you want to go, we'll bring the resources up and get the information that you want and need. Just real quick, for the public's benefit, we did place a sales tax measure on last November's ballot, and with the public support it passed, which was outstanding. It was for a full cent on the sales tax, and it's been implemented since April 1st. So it is a 1% transaction use tax. Our estimate right now is about $22 million a year generated, all funds to be used locally. It is a general tax, so it's not restricted, but the emphasis has always been, and council guidance has been, to focus its use on infrastructure solely. Infrastructure spending and priorities. We came to the City Council in February after the passage and say, can you set the priorities for the first 5 fiscal years about how we should spend the money? And Council did. Number 1 was planning, permitting, and bonding for a new police station facility. The only way to pay for a project of that magnitude really is to borrow money, and so that's why the bonding language is in there. And we won't do that until we have a site selected and a design approved and ready to go, but that is our long-term expectation in the out years, to have debt financing for the police facility. Repairing local streets throughout the city, including related street infrastructure. We'll talk about all these more in more detail. Replacing Fire Station number 7 was a council priority. Community projects to support the city's parks and libraries. You'll see a number of capital projects related to parks and libraries. Council added a business district infrastructure project line item into Measure C, and then maintenance of city buildings. So, first, street infrastructure. We've talked about this. Yes,
Just real quick,
Yeah.
go back to that previous slide. Did we have those numbers on there? Is that just a list, or is that's not implying order of priority, is it?
I'm trying to remember the conversation on February 6th. I think they're in somewhat of a priority order, but not strictly. It's not written. As you can see, this is language from the resolution. It doesn't say that this is in priority order.
I think the top 2 are to indicate sort of the priority based on the community response, but then the rest of them are kind of just a list of the other things that are important.
Probably better to take those numbers off.
Sure, we could just make them bullets.
Yeah.
Yes, I don't think it's to imply that maintenance of city buildings is the
Right.
least important of that. I think, as we mentioned yesterday in the Public Works budget, they're all important. So it's a fair point that maybe we should just not number them. So street infrastructure, we've been talking for years about the need for significant new investment to prevent the decline. And so council already took the first quarter of the sales tax from April 1st of this fiscal year and put it straight into street paving. So that's been over $5 million, and you'll be seeing that benefit. You've already seen it in a couple of areas already. Street-related infrastructure, that includes traffic signals, sidewalks, access ramps, street lights, storm drains, curb and gutter. And you'll see in a little bit more kind of the detailed breakdown of the investment in those areas. The police station. We've talked about this for a number of years. It's currently located on Figueroa Street on a fairly constrained site. And so the money in the first years will go for the planning and permitting for the police station. And then once we're ready to start construction, we'll do the debt financing for that. This will be a challenge. Site selection will be the first key decision to make. We will be coming on June 5th to council with an update on the architect selection process. Once we have the architect team on board, then working with them, we'll look at a number of city-owned properties and even possibly private-owned properties to see if we can find a location other than Figueroa Street for a police station. The benefit of finding another location is you don't have the relocation cost and headache of building on site and relocating the police department for 2 years while you're building on site. So that's a great advantage. The difficulty is finding a good location off site. We've tried this a couple times and it's just hard to find something that has the right size, access points, geographical right part of town. We don't believe you want to be below the freeway or in a flood zone with an essential facility. And so those types of considerations will go into the site selection. Don't need to go much into the need, but the police station has outgrown its useful size. It was built in 1959 for a city population that was substantially less and a police department staffing level that was substantially less. And then one of the key things is the seismic standards. The current building does not meet necessary seismic standards. And as I mentioned yesterday, a new police station will meet the highest essential facility seismic requirements, which will make it on a per square foot basis probably the most expensive building we will build in the city. So it won't be cheap.
You know, I had a question about that. Is it possible to build elements of the building at different seismic standards? Could you pull apart pieces? You know, for example, could you have community meeting rooms that serve dual purpose and have a campus style development that would be different and less expensive in elements? Is that something that the architects and the site planners are going to consider?
Yes, if we've got space to work with. I think the challenging part is if it's integrated into the building, then the whole building needs to have the structural support to support the whole building. If you've got enough room that you could maybe break it off as different physical components of the building, that might be something to look at and talk to the chief building official and look at the code carefully and see if you can do that. So I think that is one of the things. We'll be site constrained in many ways to be able to accomplish that, but certainly something to look at.
Well, something to think about at the beginning because it's a site decision question that may save money in the long run.
Exactly right.
Okay.
Yep. Fire stations, we've talked about this. Fire Station 7 in particular needs to be rebuilt. It's co-located right now with the U.S. Forest Service in trailers. We continue to talk to the Forest Service about financially participating in a new building. It has been difficult to get their commitment to do so. So we'll continue to have that conversation, but at some point we need to build Fire Station 7. Could be on the existing site. We're also looking at the Sheffield Reservoir corner just up the block as maybe a potential location as well. Maintenance of city facilities, we talked about this yesterday, and Mr. Wilshire is here to talk about it more. But we've got a lot of old buildings within the city. A lot are nearing 100 years old. Parks has dozens of facilities citywide. We've got 2 library buildings and a lot of general government and public works and other purpose buildings that require ongoing maintenance, and we can dig deeper into that as you like. And then Parks and Recreation facilities, Cabrillo Pavilion in particular is the large one that's under construction. You will see when I come up to the spreadsheet portion that we need to come up with $5 million from Measure C to go towards paying off that construction cost. and you'll see our recommendation, I'll talk about it more when we get there, is to spread that out over a number of years with a short-term loan from the general fund. We've talked to you about that a little bit already. You'll see why we're suggesting that for your consideration and how that will play out. But then beyond that, there are a number of parks facilities that is going through the design phase that will be looking for money either statewide through grants or through Measure C or through the general fund. And we'll talk about those in more detail. And then library improvements. That's another general fund supported that has capital needs. It's a beautiful historic building, serves a lot of different purposes. It serves as a library, an education center, an art gallery, public community space, you name it. And there are a number of projects that have been on the wish list and need to do list. It needs an ADA elevator. When we built the children's library downstairs, we committed to the building official that we would be moving expeditiously on getting an ADA elevator to access all the different floors. And so that's kind of something that I feel an obligation that we need to do, especially for a building that's so heavily used by all different types of users in the community. In addition to that, Library Plaza was a redevelopment agency project that was kind of next up when redevelopment got taken away. There's interest from the library board to bring that project back and make it active. It's a great project. The library patio up off the second floor has building deficiencies, and so that would be great to implement. So just a number, and then East Side Library improvements on top of that.
How much is the elevator, ballpark?
Oh, I think we might have it coming up here. Or Mike, do you want to...
Committee, we're currently in. Yeah, it's on. We're currently in RFP, so we have $100,000 for design this fiscal year, 2018. We have a budgetary number of about $1 million for construction, but we don't build a lot of elevators, so we'll see when construction bids come in.
Okay, thank you.
And where you build it will have an influence on the cost as well. If it's on the exterior of the building, then you have Historic Landmarks Commission in dealing with the sensitive building. If we're able to get it into the interior of the building, that's not quite as big of an issue. So if you don't mind, I will now go to some spreadsheets that kind of start laying all this out. And let me preface again, like we talked about yesterday at council, our wish and dream list is bigger than the money we have available. Again, fabulous that we have Measure C and we're going to be able to get so much done. But we don't have enough to go completely to everything we want. And we also don't have enough money to get it all done in the first 2 years. You know, I think all of us are anxious to get projects completed right away, and just the math doesn't allow us to get to everything immediately. So for FY19, this is staff's recommended first budget, and certainly looking for Finance Committee and the Council's reaction and adjustments as you see fit. This is an important process. The outer years will then kind of tie into our capital improvement programming cycle, and that will give a more detailed look to the outer years. But for now, for fiscal year 19, needing about $2 million for the first year for working on the police station. That will include the staff cost, architecture and engineering services, environmental review, site selection, and everything that goes into building a major infrastructure. And you'll see about that level for the first 3 years or so. That just goes into the preliminary and design work that needs to be done for a major facility. Under Public Works, you've got $12 million in change for pavement. You will see a similar hefty amount in the outer years as well to be the contribution towards the streets in the community. Streets infrastructure below is in addition to the $12 million. Just want to make sure we understand that we are adding to the $12 million for the streets and pavement area. So access ramps, about $850,000. Storm drains, $1.2 million. We haven't invested really any money in storm drains in decades. Traffic signals, keeping them up to date from a safety standpoint and operational, $1 million. Street lights, just a continued improvement to your street light system, and sometimes major repairs and investments into street lights. We've seen a couple failures around town in the last number of years that have required a complete reworking of the system that isn't cheap. And then sidewalks, a commitment about $900,000 towards sidewalks. Moving on to fire, the fire station has an immediate need for a fire station alerting system. And so that is technology in each station that notifies when a call comes in and when the firefighters need to be moving on scene. We have an old, outdated system, and so that became a short-term needed priority for fire. Parks and Recreation, just a little cleanup in fiscal year 19 on Cabrillo Pavilion and the bathhouse renovation. You will see in the outer years, that's when we would be paying the loan from the general fund for the construction. So that'll show up on the next slide for Cabrillo Pavilion. Louise Lowry Davis Center has a design for doing a renovation. So this is the cost to implement that renovation. It's a good project for a heavily used community facility. I will tell you that we will pause on that while we do the site selection analysis for the police station in case the Louise Lowry Davis complex becomes a possibility for a police station. We don't want to have just invested heavily into the building if it might be incorporated or who knows what come into play as part of that. If the police station goes somewhere else, then we would like to move forward with the improvements to the Louise Lowry Davis Center. And then we have business corridor improvements, $250,000 per year. I think initial focus would be on State Street, but it would be available for other business corridors as well. And then facilities maintenance, you saw some of this yesterday, but fire stations 3, 4, and 5, we're calling them minor renewal, but they're really critical renewals to those buildings that are used 24 hours a day by our firefighters. Los Baños boiler replacement, we talked briefly about that yesterday as well, and the East Side Library improvements. So those all fall under the facilities maintenance category. It goes in a hurry, and you can see we're at $22 million just with those projects in the first year.
Councilmember Friedman has a question.
In addition to Measure C, there's also SB1 funds that are coming in. How much do we expect to get, and then where under this chart would those funds kind of be allocated in a general sense?
Good question. I'm going to turn to someone from Public Works to explain the SB1 distribution of money.
I can answer the second part of that. So that those monies are accounted for in our streets fund, so they're not sort of part of the general fund. Streets fund has other funding sources, Measure A, and things like that, as well as gas tax, and including SB1. And in terms of the amount, Jim can tell you what that is.
Yeah, good afternoon, committee members. I'm Jim Dewey, the Streets Operations and Infrastructure Manager. And at FY19, we're expecting to receive $1.6 million in SB1 funds. And that will go primarily to overlays and surface treatments for the roads.
I think that answers my question. So some is street infrastructure, but more towards the road portions of it. And overlays.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so then the next slide I'd like to show you is the general fund capital program for FY19. And I just kind of want to toggle between those two because I think combined that gives you a sense of what your capital program is for fiscal year 19. So start at the bottom. The original proposed second year of the 2-year budget had $900,000 set aside for general fund capital. We have an adjustment of a little over $1 million. That's primarily, if you recall, we set aside half of our year-end surplus to general fund capital, and so that's the money we carried forward. So then we have a general fund capital program of just shy of $2 million. So spending that $2 million, look at the recommended budget column on the far right. For Public Works, we've annually just tried to stay at our ADA transition plan implementation, and so we're recommending that be up to $250,000. Walkways and building pathways, this is kind of goes under your facilities maintenance of taking care of the exteriors of city facilities for $100,000. Finish off this citywide wayfinding sign program. We did a phase 1. This would be phase 2 of that implementation. I think it's been very well received, the quality of that signage, and so we'd like to finish that off. Neighborhood Improvement Task Force, we've been putting a little money aside each fiscal year to give some minor improvement abilities from that group to work on park and facility improvements. Within Parks and Recreation, they traditionally have been the lion's share of the general fund capital program, at least for the last number of years. So off-leash dog area, that's at McKenzie Park for $135,000. That's been planned, designed, and ready to go. The 1,000 Steps renovation, you can see that we're recommending not needing the $100,000 for the design. That's because we took some of the oil spill money that we received and dedicated it to the 1,000 Steps program. And so that is how that design work is still moving forward. And you'll see in the outer years, we'll still need to finish off the total cost for that project. Ortega Park renovation, the $225,000. I talked to Rich Hanna this morning about this, and now I'm blanking on what the $225,000 is going on. Jill, can you hop up and Because we just funded the design work for Ortega Park, and I forget what FY19 that portion is going for.
Sorry, good afternoon. The 225 actually will support the continuation of the design work. The funding that council approved a couple of weeks ago was for the master plan, which will give us a concept plan. That 225 will help us move toward actually complete construction drawings and more planning. And we're hopeful we'll be able to also combine that with some existing funds, because we will need a little bit more than that, but we think that will get us to what we need to move forward.
And I believe that's the same answer to the West Beach Aquatic Facility, 100,000, as that will get you to the final design as well.
Similar answer. We, in the process of beginning our scoping for that effort, realized we also need to look at some infrastructure, restroom improvements associated with that project. We move forward with the contract with the consultant, with the request that once these funds came through, we take it to that next phase. So it'll get us to final plans, but not construction drawings.
And while you're here, Franceschi Park.
And Franceschi Park, this follows on council recommendation to move forward with coming up with an interpretive pavilion in lieu of restoring the house. And at the time that presentation was made to council, we were also asked to look at the broader master plan update process for the whole park, and also to look at the environmental constraints considerations, since historic resources will be a primary consideration in moving that project forward once we have a design.
Thank you, Jill. Then just finishing out the list, and we can certainly come back to any of these items in more detail. 2 library projects. One is a security camera for the Central Library. Just from a staff safety and public safety standpoint, we would like to have a little increase in security. That's been in consultation with library staff and the police department. And then a real need to improve the staff workspace renovation project. We've already done the design work. This will actually get it done. If you've been in the library, off of the basement going out towards the back is where the staff does all the book sorting in their work, and it's really the working conditions can be and should be improved. And so that's a priority for us. And then $150,000 to help build out the downtown visitor center at the Hotel Californian. This has been a long time in making, since we called it Entrada 20 years ago. And so this is kind of our contribution to build out the shell space, and then the Chamber of Commerce will operate it and have public restrooms incorporated into the visitor center there. So we're excited that that's finally coming to fruition. So planned capital needs. Let's just talk briefly about this, and we can go back. So the prior 2 slides were for fiscal year 19. What this slide is trying to show, and Bob, do you have a handout that I can see more easily for me? What this is trying to show, if you look at the bottom line, you see red. It means that everything on here can't be funded with the amounts that we're recommending. Not going to help me. So you can see up top, the police station, you got $2 million a year, again, as you build out the design, engineering, and environmental review for the police station. We're not sure if that's going to be enough or not. We'll know more as we get into it, and that will have to adjust. You can see it's kind of at the top. That is, psychologically, we're going to build a police station. And so if that $2 million needs to become $3 million for a certain year because the amount of work is just requiring it, we're going to have to adjust on that. Public Works, you see pavement as $12 million for the first couple years, and then it toggles down to $10 million. This is staff's recommendation of what we think is a quality pavement program when combined with Measure A and SB1. So the caveat there would be is if SB1 got repealed, that's the state gas tax money that will be providing millions of dollars once it gets fully implemented. If it stays fully implemented, we're comfortable with the Measure C contribution of dropping down to $10 million. If SB1 drops off, we're going to have to revisit that number and decide if it needs to be beefed up locally or not.
Councilmember Dominguez.
So those numbers, how do those interface with the Public Works Department's estimation of the pavement condition? What will that bring us to, and how long will it keep us there? Does this bring us to A level and keep us there for the next 6 years?
Councilmember Dominguez, when we put this program together, We figured that we have a target for a 70 PCI, which would put us on average in a good range, and that would take us 12 years at this particular funding. When you look at years 2020, 2021, that continued funding, if it continues for 12 years, would get us to a 70 PCI.
And where are we now?
58.
So that's about 1% or 1 PCI unit per year?
Yes.
And is that what the 12 million will do? Will it be kind of a flat line, or are we going to bump it up by picking some of the worst roads? Or
Yeah, the total investment that we'd need to make would be about $15.5 million a year in order to do that. But just in Measure C funds, we would need to continue that the $10 million in pavement.
Jim, talk a little bit, though, about your priority targeting of streets and the types of streets you're going after in the earlier years and how that kind of works itself
and I
out.
don't necessarily want to go into that again. If there's time and there's interest, we can hear that. But what I think we heard yesterday and today is there's a need to see the whole picture for the streets. We're seeing it in several different fund categories, and that's, I don't think, how people visualize the streets. So if we're going to get 15 million because of the other funding sources, and that's going to bring us up to a 62, I think it's important to hear that, or whatever it's going to bring us up to. Because I think that's how the public, and honestly, we probably think about things. So these numbers don't really provide that context. So I don't know if at the Measure C, the next Measure C event, we could have a slide or two that talk about that. Because we had a lot of good information about that at previous Finance Committee meetings. And so we could maybe have one or two of those slides kind of that combines all the funding sources.
Sure.
Yeah, just so I'm clarifying so we make sure we get you what you're looking for. You want to look at the total funding for streets capital that's going on from all the different sources and where that's going. Absolutely.
And the impact it will have on the streets, health and quality of life for our residents.
You bet.
Yes,
And
but to be specific, we need an investment about $16 million in pavement of the different kinds of pavement treatments and to fund the access ramps that'll be going in. And that'll be ongoing for at least 12 years in order to get to a PCI of 70.
So would it be fair to characterize that's your planning horizon? Is that 70 and 12 years?
Right now, with the assumptions that we have in place, yes.
So you'd every street, not every street, because it would be a 70, not a 100, but are there maps that are associated with that plan to get the 70 PCI?
We have a map that identifies 10 years worth of projects that I brought with me. It's a complicated map with a lot of information on it, but we do have that much information, yes.
So that would show us what streets would be touched in that 10-year
Yes,
period.
it doesn't say exactly when each street will be touched, but it shows the total, and it also shows our plan for FY19.
Okay. Why doesn't it show the years that it would be done?
Because we're still working through a lot of coordination issues. We need to coordinate with all the other work that's happening in the public right-of-way, and then also coordinate some of our work, too.
Okay, so
some of our
you don't
grant
know
work
which year specifically, but you know that all these streets would be done in that 10 years.
Correct, yeah. Even in FY19, we're at 90% right now. We'll be at 100% shortly. And then as we roll out, of course, the near years are going to have more accuracy than the further years out. But we've definitely identified 10 years worth of the priority streets. So we know what that looks like and how much that would cost.
Since there's a 12-year horizon to get to the 70, wouldn't it make sense to have that map be a 12-year map to do?
Yeah, we just haven't gotten to that point yet as far as planning.
Okay.
And also there will be, at 10 years from now, there's going to be other elements of preventive maintenance that get triggered from the work that we've already done.
Mm-hmm. So have you thought all that all the way through? Like at some point you're not going to be doing as much repair, deep repair. You're going to be doing more surface treatments to maintain. And so that is my fundamental premise in the way I'm thinking about that, is that we have an opportunity here to do lots of work to get caught up to a point where the ongoing investments are less over time. And I'm trying to get a handle on how that works. Because one thing that stuck in my head yesterday, as in Mr. Casey's comments about how we don't have enough money to do everything, is that is a time-constrained comment. And this is not a time-constrained resource. This is a permanent funding source, which is different than how we have been conceptualizing it in the past. In the past, we have been thinking in terms of 20 years and 30 years. What could we do? What could we accomplish? What trade-offs would be necessary? So I'm starting to realize that this is different and that this is a new opportunity with unlimited funding to understand how all these pieces fit together over a long period of time. And making decisions at the beginning affects what we achieve over long periods of time. And that's what I think is missing. I'm getting a really strong sense that you have a great plan, based on the culture and history of the way the organization used to operate, which is very constrained and limited funding and not the ability to have a long-term plan. And that we're culturally evolving to where we were imagining longer term plan, 20, 30 years. Now we have, potentially 40, 50 years plan. And that I'd love to see that all fit together. And so to me, this is screaming for a strategic plan that fits all of these pieces together with all the departments so that everybody can calm down, and understand that their needs are all going to be met over enough time. That I don't even know that we should ever say anymore that we don't have enough money to do these things. It's just a question of when we would do these things. Right. And that's a big difference in how you look at this. So that's what I'm kind of hoping we could get a better sense of. I know it's short and it may not be realistic, in this budget cycle, but that would be the goal, would be to have a strategic plan that talks about, 50 years. How do we get everything done in 50 years? And then knowing we'll have to do it all again in the next 50 years after that. But when we get on top of the maintenance backlog, the ongoing price tag is going to be less and more sustainable and more reasonable within that second 50 years.
Yeah, Chair Hart, I guess we're moving from a place where we have all of this modeled. It's a model, so we have the long-term plan for the model, and then there's reality. Mm-hmm. And when you ask, have we wrapped our minds completely around the exact plan? No, we haven't. We're moving from the model into reality, so there's a lot of coordination that needs to happen for that. But we are working towards that. Okay,
and of course there would be no plan that you could make today that would last for 50 years. You would have to refresh that plan every 5 years. But having some kind of idea about a longer-term planning horizon that would, address all of these things and have everybody say, okay, well, that's a plan that makes sense over a longer period, is as opposed to we have a 5-year plan that doesn't speak to what happens after 5 years. That's the difference in what I'm trying to get to in my aspirations.
I hear you. I think we've got more than you're giving us credit for.
Okay.
Because when you bring in the debt service for the police station, it's going to take a big chunk out of this.
Right, but that ends in 20 years.
It's a 20-year plan, exactly.
So that's what I'm saying is that I understand that 20-year plan. I understand a 12-year plan for street maintenance to get up to the level of PCI. I don't understand the other pieces and how they relate to 10 or 20 or 30-year planning horizons. And so that's what I'm trying to get my head around and to integrate is the rest of those things. We've got a finite number of buildings with a large price tag on how much they will take to be invested in. But how do those fit as the police station bond runs out after 20 years, as the first 12 to 15 years of street maintenance is sustained and the cost of that drops? Seems like there's a lot of capacity after 25 years. And is that the next 20 years of the plan is to catch up on all the buildings? What will happen to those buildings in the meantime? Because there will be people saying to us, do the buildings now, soon. And that's a valid point. But if there was a way to say, we have a plan to do your buildings, and that they're not going to deteriorate to the point where they're uninhabitable because we're going to maintain them over the next 20 years, then that can give people some comfort knowing all of these things are going to be met over a longer period planning horizon, as opposed to doing this ad hoc every 5 years and having the political whims change, the emphasis based on every 5 years look at it. And then you lose the commitment to the roads. That's what I'm concerned about.
I hear you. I'm not sure I completely agree with you, with all due respect, because I think that you have a practical reality of the 20-year plan with the police station when you bring on that debt service and the commitment to roads. There's not a lot left during that 20-year period. We can spend time on planning out what that year 20 to year 45 scenario is. I'm just not sure how super valuable that is because it's so far off. There will be changes. What you decide as a council today isn't really going to lock in 6 generation councils from now when that
No,
year
of
20
course I
comes,
understand
comes
that.
out. So
and you're right. There's how much do you overplan today?
Right.
But leaving it completely as there is no conversation about it means that you don't have anything else other than roads and police station. I don't think that's politically sustainable.
yeah. So, I mean, that's something that we could do. I don't think we're going to do it in time for this fiscal year's budget to get adopted. We are undertaking a capital improvement plan update as part of next fiscal year's budget, and so that might be a very good, appropriate time to give us some time to kind of plan that out and have that long-term thought and process put to it. We could do that.
The other big picture thing is the cost of the police station. Very unknown.
Yep.
We really have no idea.
Yep.
But that also could just consume everything.
Yep.
I mean, there is not a good track record on public infrastructure and construction of buildings to know that estimates today have much meaning to the actual cost. And the Cabrillo Rec Center is the best example of that. I think that project has doubled in cost.
Yep.
And so that has to be very soberly thought about.
And I mentioned that yesterday.
Yes.
I don't want to put a number at it because I'm
Right.
concerned about when we choose a site and actually get a preliminary design about what that cost will be.
Right.
And I'm concerned as well that will be a very sobering reality with our commitment to build that about what we'll have left to do, again, for that 20-year time horizon.
Okay. Thank you. Councilmember Dominguez.
Why don't I
Yeah, go ahead.
you want me to finish?
Just
or you
one
wanna-
more thing I
Yep.
want to ask, if it's possible to bring it into the next presentation. I'm not going to ask to predict what's going to happen with Iran. Barrels of oil are up to like $80 because of what's happening with foreign relations, and that's going to have a big impact on how much streets we can pay for in the next dozen years, more than probably anything else. But what I'd like to see is how much we are paying per street mile or whatever figures you have. And again, kind of hopefully an assessment that we're getting better at it, or we will be better because of the economy of scale. But just whatever information you have along those lines, because I think people want to see they're getting some kind of value for their money, and we're not just going to increase the budget because we have more money, but we're actually going to produce dollar per dollar more roads, or there's some kind of qualitative or quantitative efficiency for people's vote for the Measure C and the upcoming SB1 potential.
And yeah, well, I'm seeing people nod that we can get you that information. I think they touched on it briefly yesterday that we are seeing the economies of a larger contract for paving getting us a better price per square foot from contractors, because there just is that efficiencies of rollout and such. The other issue is just a look on the outer years. So we touched about the police station, pavement, and then you have the other streets infrastructure. You can see kind of keeping an ongoing focus on that. The outer years, you can see this is kind of a wish list. These aren't budgeted. They're not balanced. But Fire Station 7 eventually is going to kick in, and initial estimates, it's going to be in the $4 to $5 million range. And so how do we fund that? Parks and Recreation, this is where I talked about Cabrillo Pavilion. We need $5 million for Cabrillo Pavilion, technically in FY19 next year. That was going to be such a hit on our ability to get a jump start on pavement and everything else that we're recommending that we take a 5-year loan from the general fund for $1 million a year, interest-free, and kind of float that with Measure C, paying the general fund back over a relatively short period. So you can see the $1 million per year paying off the Cabrillo Pavilion debt. So looking for your feedback on that, if you agree with that approach or have a different approach of trying to crack that nut. 1,000 steps, that's where $1 million more is needed. That could be grant funding. It could be scaled back project scope, so we'll see how that comes about. The other design work that we've done on the parks, we've had conversations with you recently about that. Could be Measure C funded. Again, there could be a statewide parks bond that might provide us access to a lot of revenue for that. But Dwight Murphy Field is about a $4 million project. The West Beach Splash Playground is just under $1 million. Bonet Park is a little over $1 million. Ortega Park could be upwards of $4 million in the early years, and a real big play could be $7 million in the out years. So again, we're not recommending these necessarily in the fiscal year, but in a perfect world, if you lined them all up, that's when you'd want to start getting at them. The library, you can see you got Library Plaza and also the ADA elevator, and so we need to talk more about that. And then down on the bottom, you have the business improvement districts, and then you got facilities maintenance as well, which always keeps showing up at the bottom. So we're going to flip that around at one of these charts just to make sure it's not always on the bottom psychologically. But you can see we're short millions of dollars to get to that wish list. So there will need to be priority setting done in the early years, and I completely agree with you, Councilmember Hart, that it's a timing issue more than a monetary issue. Because of the commitment of this funding over an extended period of time, we can eventually get to all this. But the desire is we all want it tomorrow and right away. And so that's where choices will be made. And that's why we're in the fortunate position to have money to have to make those choices. I always want to remind us, we're really fortunate to have $22 million to get at stuff. And even though it's not enough, we should never forget that this is a great opportunity for us to be investing dramatically in our community, which is good. So that kind of wraps up that. Happy to go back to any of these slides. Again, I've got staff in the crowd. If you have other suggestions you'd like us to be prepared for when we're at the full council, that's great to give us a heads up, and we can incorporate that into that presentation.
Councilmember Friedman.
Thank you for that presentation. Very informative on where we're going. One of the things I wanted to, a couple items. The first is the library plaza I wanted to look at. It's $3 million on this. Gets into the discussion where we're going. I'd like us to consider as part of the recommendation that we put some funding towards the plaza this year for a few different reasons. One is that there's some unique circumstances going on at the library right now and going into the future that make this project actually very timely. The first is that we have an opportunity with a public-private partnership with the foundation, the Public Library Foundation, to raise significant funding going forward. I've spoken with their president, and they are actually gearing up to do a capital campaign to raise the money. So if we came in early, it would help them raise those funds. And if you go back to the slide that we were just at, I think it's slide 33, that shows it has the $3 million price tag in year 3. But and then the red is $8.9 million. If we were to come in at, say, $500,000 as part of this year's Measure C, it would help the foundation go forward the next couple of years and raise that funding, and they could raise a significant portion of it, and it would actually, hopefully, shrink that red number there. And one of the reasons it's critical now that we go forward with the plaza, there was a couple, but is that the art museum is in the process of their renovations right now, and that plaza is out of commission. So, because the art commission is staging there. So we would have an opportunity to raise the funding while the art museum is using that plaza. And then hopefully if we could coordinate things, we could get into a situation where when they're done when they're done staging, we could come in and update our plaza. And the reason for that is important because then we wouldn't lose any revenue from it. A new plaza would be a revenue generator over time. You could do a lot of great community events there. And one of the other things I look at is when we go into the downtown area, there's the Historic Arts District there. And our council has contributed significant funds to the the Arts District there, $8 million to some of the renovations at the Granada, the Art Museum. And that library plaza is a key component of what we want to do there. So one of the things is if we kind of look at downtown and what we can invest in, that plaza is a key issue for that because it would allow for more opportunities to have arts festivals, literary festivals, art in public places. So, and again, the timing is the key. There's better lighting that would go in it. So I would propose that this year, as part of the Measure C, that we would actually allocate $500,000 which would signal to the foundation to go ahead and begin their capital campaign. And just as a background, when we built the children's library, they were at a point where the city had invested some, but there was a significant portion, and the city actually came in and invested $500,000 towards the project, and the foundation was able to then go and raise a remaining $1 or $1.2 million that solidified that. So I think having an early contribution from the city would go a long way, and it would shrink that red number there in year 2020. So I hope that we would consider that as part of our recommendations today, $500,000 towards that. I also, in terms of the overall budget, I would consider $100,000 to visit Santa Barbara, not the full 150. I think that the county and city of Goleta should take some role in this. It shouldn't just be borne on us to do this because tourism benefits all our jurisdictions. I just don't want us to be on the wrong side of wish we would have donated a little bit more for the marketing campaigns. Kathy Janega Dykes with Visit Santa Barbara showed us what they're going to do. I think it's important this summer to get us back on track, so I would support $100,000 in that effort. And then there's another item on here that it's not on here, but it's the issue of since we're making recommendations for the final budget, is a consultant to bring in for the downtown plan. And the more I thought about it, I think in light of the conversations that took place for a couple weeks ago, the brainstorming sessions and others that have been taking place on the future of downtown, and just the capacity of our city administrator's office to really do that, I think they have limited capacity. So I would support funding. We can talk about the level at another time because we're running short on time here, but to have a consultant that would come in and rather than trying to develop recommendations, would actually look at the work that's been done recently with that design charrette, with the build upon the the downtown organization, their retail study, and really put all those pieces together. And it would be a short one-time fund, and they would come back in the fall or in the early part of next year, and we could get some recommendations on where to move forward from there in terms of pieces that could come before the council so we could take some action. I think the time is right to do that now, so I'd also want to look at funding the consultant to come in and work with our city administrator to put all these pieces together and really kind of have a plan that we can look at in a short amount of time and then take some action in either later this year or early next year. Overall, those are the three items that I'm looking at. Overall, I think the rest of the budget is strong and gets us where we need to be. Thank you.
Mr. Chair,
Councilman.
this kind of segues into the last portion, which is real quick. Wanted to mention that we've already heard from you about your recommendations on these items here, the proposed fees, the revenue assumptions for the general fund. And we just kind of made a nod because you mentioned it, not as a recommendation, but just that you'd be looking at next year for the waterfront fund, potentially look at raising slip fees 3% instead of 2%. So we've got that noted. And then, of course, the impounding of scooters, you had recommended $500. So this is what you've already kind of indicated to us. And this is really what's left. As Mr. Friedman kind of touched on, the Measure C, but also the one or two staff recommended adjustments. You looked at the budget for the economic vitality, arts and economic vitality. If you had any comments or suggestions there, didn't need necessarily any action there. And then the funding from Visit Santa Barbara of $150. So this is what's sort of left in terms of what we're needing or asking direction from the committee on for recommending to council.
Any other questions or comments? I think Councilmember Friedman summarized those other additional items well. I'm seeing a connection between the additional funding request from Visit Santa Barbara and the additional fee increase in the waterfront. The waterfront is a major revenue source. The land leases in the waterfront are a major revenue source for the waterfront, and so providing providing advertising and economic revitalization efforts, we benefit from that significantly, both in terms of the lease revenue from the businesses that are operating there as well as the sales tax. So I see a nexus there. I know it's not a traditional role the waterfront has played with its funding sources, but I don't know why that is the case. I mean, they are an enterprise fund that, they have events and to advertise their customers and their tenants, and this is a variation on that. And this is an extraordinary moment, and I know their revenues suffered from the same events. I think there's a nexus there, but other folks may have different ideas about that. And I do particularly like the idea that our other funding partners with Visit Santa Barbara would have a financial obligation to support that effort. So to me, it would be like a challenge grant if we can get $50,000 from the other entities, and I'd include the city of Carpinteria in that, even though they don't have a traditional relationship with Visit Santa Barbara. They ought to. There's no reason why they should be a free rider in when we're advertising regionally. Councilmember Dominguez, do you have any thoughts or additions or anything? Okay, and then again, back to what I had said earlier, I'm looking for a strategic plan for Measure C. I'm looking for a long-term, 30, 40-year strategic plan that shows how all these pieces fit together. Because I agree that we can't do it all immediately, but I do want to focus in on the fact that I think we can do it all in time, and that I think the voters and the taxpayers would love to see that kind of a plan, and that would provide some discipline to councils as we go forward to make sure that we don't make decisions that have long-term ramifications on the ability to do all these things. And it's going to be a challenge to hold to priorities as costs increase inevitably and revenue streams change. But this is the opportunity to set the tone at the very beginning. And I still do think that there is real merit in doing a bond for street maintenance and having that financial obligation, just like the police department. That's a commitment. You don't get to waver off that. How much you do and how long you do it is certainly something to be discussed, because you don't want to lock in at too high a rate that you couldn't afford these other things at a reasonable timetable. But that's where having a strategic plan helps you understand that better. Other than, the historical reality is we have had funding opportunities come like this in the past that have been diluted over time and have not delivered on the promises. And that is more likely to happen than not if we don't do things differently this time going forward. So that's my 2 cents today. Any other questions or comments? Councilmember Dominguez?
I would just say I agree. I didn't want to have my silence interpreted either for or against any of the ideas, but I think having a master strategic plan that even just starts with a value statement, where do we want our streets to be? 75 good enough? Is 70? Just something like that I think is a great idea, so we don't just make willy-nilly decisions, and every year we can adjust kind of the value statements and then the numbers that flow from that if needed. But I think that's a great idea.
Mr. Samaro.
Yeah, so just to kind of put things in, to tidy things up. So on the Measure C and General Fund Capital, looking for maybe a vote on each of these items in terms of what the recommendation specifically might be. I heard coming back with more information at the next meeting on June 4th, I believe, or 5th, where we talk more about Measure C, kind of talking about the bigger picture and how the funding sources come together. But I heard also a strategic plan, so I'll take that as a recommendation, but maybe just a vote, hearing a vote on that. And then just a vote on the staff recommended adjustments, and then some consensus and recommendation on the fourth item, which is how we pay for and how much we contribute toward Visit Santa Barbara's one-time request. So just looking for specific recommendations that we can take to the City Council.
Yeah, we could use a motion, and including whether Councilmember Friedman's suggestions on a consultant for downtown strategic plan, and also on the Library Plaza. We just need some guidance about what we want to tell council is coming from this committee.
Well, we need a number for the consultants, so we can't do that as part of this piece, unless you have a number.
I don't have a number for that. That's why I wanted to.
You could conceptually, though, if we say to fund a study and we can make an estimate, but I think that would be helpful if there was a recommendation on the concept.
Or you could ask that you want to consider the concept with the full council and give us the 2 weeks to try to peg a number at it, so you've got something to react to in front of the full council if there's conceptual interest in it.
Well, we have one more finance committee meeting before.
No, this is it.
This is it.
This is it.
Okay, well, we could schedule a meeting at the finance committee for that day as well.
We could. The day that we were going to come back and bring recommendations, sure.
Yeah, because I want to see it on paper before I commit to all this. And so, we're adding stuff without taking anything off. I don't know that works, so I'd like to see it on paper before, I support it.
Okay. We'll do what we can, yeah.
Okay.
So just to be clear, we'll add a finance committee meeting is it next week?
No,
No.
it won't be next week because of the holiday, but it'll be 2 weeks. So on the 5th of June 5th is when we come back to the City Council, where we're going to be presenting your recommendations. So we'll be coming to the Finance Committee and then sort of more verbally telling them what the committee is recommending in terms of the package.
Actually, Bob, let's just take 1 second to talk scheduling. So Monday, June 4th, we've got your last budget hearing that will include the City Administrator's Office, Measure C, and some other departmental requests that some of this stuff kind of ties into. So I don't know if you wanted a Finance Committee meeting prior to that on that Monday. And then on Wednesday night, June 6th at 6 p.m. is when council's giving final direction to us on the budget.
Right.
So just trying to get a sense of when you want to slot in an additional finance committee meeting.
Can I make an alternative suggestion? What do you think about recommending the staff numbers as is today with a finance committee to discuss the proposals that Mr. Friedman brought to the table today? That way we'd have a chance to get a little more information, and maybe the Library Foundation can make a presentation.
So if we're recommending it today, then we're not considering the additional?
Well, we're just recommending, I would suggest just recommending the staff recommendations today to send it to full council just in case, and so they have a little certainty. But then if Mr. Friedman wants to bring back the Library Foundation and the consultant idea, staff can bring that back as kind of an add-on, and then we can vote to add it in or not. Does that make life easier for staff or more difficult?
Yeah, I think it's indifferent. Yes, thank you.
I'd rather, if you're indifferent, I'd rather wait before we make a recommendation.
So then maybe we could meet before the June 4th. Is it June 4th? Is that the date you're saying? That's the special?
Yes, so the special meeting we have on the work session, the final work session is 2:30, from 2:30 to 5, so we can meet in advance of that.
So maybe we could meet at 1.
Right. Good. Yes.
Does that work for everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. That seems like the best alternative there. Gives you most time and gives us time before the...
Good.
And what we want to cover at that special finance committee meeting is the potential of $500,000 for the Library Plaza project in FY19, potential for some sort of consultant services for a downtown strategic plan from an economic development standpoint. We'll see what we can kind of get ballpark of what a cost or scope of that might look like to give you something to react to, but just recognize we've only got 10 working days to kind of put something together in that regard. And then what was the third thing? Was there one other?
The Visit
Oh,
Santa
visit Santa Barbara. A, do you want to fund it? And if so, how much? And if so,
From where?
What conditions and from where?
Yep. And then maybe just some more reaction to the Measure A or Measure C strategic plan ideas. I know you're not going to have anything, or do you have thoughts on that now?
My reaction, if council would like us to come up with a strategic plan, you can direct us to do so, and we'll be happy to go do it. I just don't think it's going to be done in time to influence your FY19 decision making.
Right.
It would really kind of be gearing up for that next CIP cycle over the next fiscal year. And just me thinking off the top of my head, it might be us bringing someone in to kind of help us put together a multi-year strategic plan who has experience in that. I don't know. Haven't had a chance to talk to staff about that.
Well, maybe that's what needs to happen before the next meeting. Is
could try
that
some of that.
conversation with staff to figure out what you think that might be, just so because I have a certain urgency here, just because the clock's ticking, and
Understood.
I'd like there to be something to look forward to this year.
So give us the chance to talk about it over the next 2 weeks, and we can have a continuing conversation. So then I see 4 items at the meeting. The Library Plaza, $500,000, the downtown strategic plan, the Visit Santa Barbara item, and the Measure C long-term strategic plan discussion.
And could I add, as part of the presentation for the plaza, if we could have a short presentation on where we are with the plaza, because there's a certain amount of work that's already been done in terms of design, that would be helpful to understand where we are. It's not like we're starting from scratch. There's actually permits that have been issued that we understand where those are, and any timelines that those would expire or things like that.
Another item that just occurred to me that came up during the council discussion about the Parks and Recreation Department's budget was the increased street tree planting, too. And I wonder if we could have a little more information about that. Or maybe Ms. Zachary has, I don't know if she's prepared to say anything now, but that was something that had a number of council members nodding their heads about. So we should at least integrate that into this conversation, because I think it's going to happen at the council level, so would be best to have it fit into what we're recommending if there's time and ability. So that's the fifth thing on the list.
So do you need a motion to continue this meeting until June 4th, 1 p.m.?
I don't think so.
You'll just schedule it
Yeah,
for
we'll
us?
just schedule it.
Thank you.
Okay. Is there anybody who'd like to speak to this item? In the member of the public? Bonnie, would you like to? Is there anything you wanted to add? Okay. Seeing no one, we are adjourned. Thank you.